Good afternoon, everybody. This is CyberTile back with you. It's more like it. We're finishing up our roundup of hanging pawns. We're continuing our review today of how to play with hanging pawns. I'm going to use this as sort of an opportunity as a catch-all to go over some concepts that we really didn't have a chance to go over exactly in our main sessions. Today's an excellent instructional game from Boris Spassky. He was playing Spassky-Pachman in 1962. Spassky was white, d4, knight f3. So, of course, this is an attempt from white to avoid the Nimzo Indian. Of course, the Nimzo Indian would be bishop b4. At that time in the 60s, the Nimzo Indian was heavily respected. It was seen as more or less guaranteed equality for black without really having to do all that much. So a lot of people with the white pieces were playing knight f3 to dodge the Nimzo Indian. d5, and black says that he's perfectly fine to go into a queen's gambit declined, with white having committed to knight f3. Another approach, b6, of course, would be the queen's Indian. This is a perfectly viable approach. Bishop e4, this would be the Bogo Indian. This is part of my main repertoire. Perfectly solid from black. It still has some active possibilities for play, and enough similarities to Nimzo Indian that makes a good sister repertoire to the Nimzo. But Pachman played d5 to get into the queen's gambit. Knight c3, so the main threat, just to go over some move order nonsense, the main threat that black sees in going to a queen's gambit with knight f3 not being on the board is that white gets into the mainline Carlsbad. And this is just one potential mainline. And this is sort of the key position. The fact that white hasn't committed to knight f3 here means that this line with knight ge2 is still available to white, and it's seen as a much more aggressive and dangerous possibility for white than the standard positional way of playing, which is knight f3. I personally don't agree with that characterization all the way. I think the lines with knight ge2 are dangerous, but I think the lines with knight f3 can be just as dangerous, just in a different way. But the lines with knight ge2 tend to leave white with more possibilities of a direct attack. White, because the knight's on f3, white can play f3 and e4 with a very straightforward central attack, with the threat of pushing the pawns farther up the board. So black is saying that once white is committed to knight f3, he's happy to go into these lines, queen's gambit lines, with that knight committed to f3. In my opinion, it's just a matter of taste, but it's really about what positions you're most comfortable with. Knight c3, this is correct move order. Just an example of more move order nuances. White can't force a Carlsbad from here. And then bishop f5. So now that the pawn on d5 is already reinforced with c6, this bishop is free to come to own this b1 to h7 diagonal. And this is already at least equal for black, perhaps even a bit more comfortable. So white can't force his way into the exchange queen's gambit decline. He has to just keep playing. So knight c3, bishop e7, bishop g5. White can try for these lines, but there's a specific problem here, and that's g6. So now the bishop insists on coming to f5. Black scores better than 50% from these lines, and the computer gives it as dead equal. So for people playing the queen's gambit on the white side, getting the knight committed to f3 does have some nuances where you can't play the exchange variation exclusively. You have to know the bishop g5 lines as well. So Spassky played bishop g5, which in my opinion is the correct move order here. Castle, e3, h6, b6. So this is the Tartakover. This is also called the Tartakover / Makaganov / Bondarevsky. Tartakover was the originator of this variation, then Makaganov and Bondarevsky were two strong Soviet theoreticians that developed this line for further use. Sometimes called the TMB, usually it's just called the Tartakover, which is unfair to the other two progenitors of this line, but life isn't always fair. But whatever it's called, this line, I would say, is the main line of the Queen's Gambit decline for black, and I would say the strongest approach. The other approach from this specific position, knight e4, this would be the Alaska line. In my opinion, this isn't as strong for black. This is openly playing for a draw, and like a lot of situations where you openly play for a draw, you're playing for less than half the loaf already. The best way to achieve an equal position is to play strong, active moves and fight for your share of the pie. Typically, playing for draws via exchanges leaves you a little bit on the back foot. But this is a perfectly solid line, but b6 is always scored better, and it's always given black more active possibilities than other lines for the Queen's Gambit decline. So white's never really gotten much of anything against the Tartar Cobra. This has always been a super viable option for black. c65, this was a traditional main line. Attention is shifted elsewhere in modern times, but really not with a humongous amount of success. Rook c1, in my opinion, makes the most sense. Then white waits for bishop b7, and then and only then takes on f6 and takes on d5. So the idea is that now that the bishop has committed itself to b7, it's hitting on the granite of that d5 pawn. That said, black has the bishop pair here in a position where the position really isn't closed up. The bishop pair is certainly an asset here. After bishop d3, c5, this is an equal game. Black actually even scores a little bit better than 50% from this position in the database. So this is a perfectly fine position for black. You know, white's never really gotten much of anything from it, other than an equal game against the Tartar Cobra. But c65, this is the traditional main line. Knight d5. So we have some pieces come off, and white's happy with this. We've had two sets of minor pieces come off the board. We're more or less locked into a hanging pawn structure for black. Black is going to be forced to play c5. If the pawn were still on b7, black could just be happy with playing c6, and then he would have that strong pawn chain of b7, c6, d5. And he wouldn't necessarily be forced to play c5. But with the pawn on b6, he can't move the pawn to c6, because then it's just a backward pawn without being guarded by another pawn. So he has to move it to c5. From the white side, he can say that he's happy with those hanging pawns because two sets of minor pieces are off the board. For black's purpose, he can say that these hanging pawns are going to be strong just because they're like other hanging pawns. They're fighting for the center, they're controlling valuable central space. Both results, in theory, show that this is an equal position. It's not necessarily better for black at all, but these are hanging pawns that are perfectly neutral. They're not harming black at all, but it's an even game with some interesting play to come. Bishop e2, this is a very modest way of continuing. Rook c1 was the traditional main line. That said, white's gotten less than nothing in a lot of these lines. Of course, this is the way the famous Fischer-Spassky game from the 1972 match went. Bishop e6, so because the bishop's not committed to b7, the bishop can come to the slightly better square in e6, where it's still guarding the pawn on d5, but it still has access to this diagonal here. Queen a4, c5, this is the old-fashioned main line. White's moved away from this. Queen a3, bishop e5. This was the course of the Fischer-Spassky game. The time they played this game in 1972, this was considered the main line. Oddly enough, one of Spassky's seconds for this game, Efim Geller, one of the strongest Soviet grandmasters of all time, and certainly someone that could have easily won the world championship, in my opinion. He was one of Spassky's seconds for this match. A year after the match against Fischer, he played a game against Tiemann where he more or less refuted this bishop b5 move. And he had this analysis on board for Spassky's match against Fischer in 1972. But Spassky decided not to play it for some reason. And when you see the continuation of the Tiemann-Geller game, it's really hard to imagine why Spassky didn't want to play this. But bishop e5 basically more or less got refuted by queen b7. Black is threatening c4 here, so white's more or less forced to take the sacrifice. And then knight a6. And black is just simply better here. He has more than enough for the pawn. The white king is in dire straits. It's going to get stuck in the center. The continuation of the Tiemann-Geller game was this. And with this white king unable to castle, rook c8's coming quickly. This is a miserable position for white, and certainly worth far more than a pawn. Gettler had all this analysis on board, so it's hard to imagine why Spassky didn't want to play this analysis. So bishop e2 is better, but after king f8, this is the modern continuation. Black is just fine here. These hanging pawns are not under pressure. If anything, Black's going to continue with moves like a5 to gain more space on the queen side. He can look forward to having a nice initiative if white doesn't play assertively enough. So rook c1, a little bit more natural. Bishop e2 is a little bit restrained, but either way, Black is fine here. Bishop e6, knight e5. This isn't a serious imprecision, but the knight doesn't really do anything on e5. Just castle is fine. But knight e5, c5, castle. Rook d8. This is actually a somewhat serious mistake from Black. So the rook really doesn't do anything on d8. White hasn't committed to taking on c5 yet, so it's unwise to commit that rook to d8, especially when it could potentially be better placed on c8. Knight d7 is simply a better way of proceeding. Just getting that knight off the board. c1. And this is an excellent example of a position where simplification hasn't been detrimental to the hanging pawns. Theoretically, simplification can benefit the side facing the hanging pawns if it allows you to gain pressure against the hanging pawns, or allows you to defuse a kingside initiative so you can go on the offensive. Here, these hanging pawns aren't under pressure at all. So if these hanging pawns aren't under pressure, all they're doing is controlling valuable central space. And certainly more space than white has. Black can simply continue with natural moves like a5, rook ab8. d4 is always in the cards, trying to get a strong pass pawn out of it. I would say theoretically this is even, but practically I would prefer Black, just because this is much easier to play for the Black side. White's definitely on the defensive heels. But rook d8, it allows this knight e5 to stay in place, which is slightly annoying. And it commits this rook to a square that isn't great. Now, also, we can't play knight d7 because of knight c6. That's another major tactical factor. But rook c1 makes sense. f6. This it chased the knight away, but this is positional suicide. The light squares on the king side are not happy about this. Now, under different circumstances, this could work, but it gets tactically refuted fairly easily. a5, in my opinion, is a fairly precise way of proceeding. We can't move this knight because of knight c6, so we're finding another way to get this rook into the game in a situation where Black does need to develop. So one way of proceeding, bishop e5. And maybe white's a little bit better here. This knight on b8 is a little bit awkwardly placed just because that earlier imprecision with rook d8. But this is still a decent position for Black. Black can continue with a move like rook c7, f6 under better circumstances, and then start to unwind. f6 just allows a direct refutation. So knight d6, this is the only move, but no exclamation just because it's a perfectly natural move. One thing we've discussed when fighting hanging pawns, a lot of times the critical sequences are going to be knight maneuvers, and looking for the correct knight outpost to provide pressure against the hanging pawns. Because most of the time, your bishops are going to be very clear where they're going to be best placed. The key will be maneuvering your knights to an appropriate outpost where they pressure the hanging pawns while staying active on other parts of the board. So here, knight g6, it's heading for this natural f4 square. And on the f4 square, it'll pressure the d pawn, it'll still hang around the weakened king side. It'll be a very beautifully placed piece there. Notice that knight f3, this would be a direct error, and this would allow Black a better position. c4, as we've discussed, hanging pawns are mobile, so you should always keep in mind that this resource of moving the c-pawn or the d-pawn, if we've already traded on the c5 square, those pawns are mobile. You always want to look for opportunities to push those pawns if profitable. And here, suddenly White's position is very cramped, and Black has a very easy threat of just continuing with b5, a5, b4, just continuing to roll up on the queen side. Black's just slightly better here, This is a very nice position. But knight g6 keeps the advantage. Queen d6, dxc5. So this is the correct time to transition. Otherwise, black could play c4 with a similar position to the previous note. bc, knight f4. So this is a perfect square for the knight. So here it's hitting this d pawn. It's sticking around the weakened black king side. This is an excellent position for white, and certainly it's much better. And white has very obvious follow-ups here. You can play bishop f3, queen d2, or queen c2, whichever, and rook fd1. All of white's moves to proceed are clear, and they provide heavy pressure against the hanging pawns. And it's interesting how these positions can suddenly switch on a dime, because the difference between getting pressure on the hanging pawns or not getting pressure on the hanging pawns is so often just a couple of tempi. Here, white has won this tempi, and these hanging pawns are going to be under heavy pressure. So bishop f7, queen c2, setting the c pawn, knight d7, rook fd1. So easy follow-up. So all of white's pieces are just perfectly placed. White already has a tactical threat of knight d5. This is already more or less losing for black. d4, that's a forced concession to keep equal material. If black just continues to guard, knight d5, and then white's just breaking through. This is black can more or less resign here. This is a losing position. d4 keeps material on the board, but again, when you're facing the hanging pawns, so often you want to get that concession by forcing one of the pawns to move forward under favorable circumstances. Here, because we have all of our pieces perfectly aligned against the hanging pawns, this pawn isn't a strong asset as a strong passed pawn. It's just a weakness at this point, and white's perfectly placed to attack this weakness. Bishop c4, this is logical, and I can't really give it a question mark, but there's one other move for white that is very much thematic, and you should always keep in mind, and that's b4. So when facing the hanging pawns, you always want to be looking at your pawn breaks. The B pawn break and the E pawn break are often instrumental in collapsing the hanging pawn structure. And here, b4 comes with perfect timing. It's just completely collapsing black's entire structure. cxb4. This is the main line I had. This is even material, but this is positionally losing for black. Both the A pawn and the B pawn are quite weak. White owns the C file. All of white's pieces are much more active than their black counterparts. Material loss is more or less inevitable for black. If black refuses to take, if he tries to hold on, this is more or less a forced line. I would say this isn't losing yet, because black still has, when you have the queen against the two rooks, there's always random checks and random wackadoodle counterplay that you can get. But here, the two rooks certainly favor white, especially since the d pawn is very likely to drop off. And then two rooks and a pawn versus a queen heavily favors the two rooks. So bishop c4, it's not bad. But b4 is just one of those thematic moves that you always want to be keeping in mind. Your pawn breaks are always the engine of your play. When you're facing the hanging pawns, always keep your b pawn and e pawn breaks in mind. But bishop c4, not optimal, but it's good enough. Bishop xc4, this is very compliant. Knight e5 is better. And this is certainly on the verge of winning for whites. It's not a knockout blow. Queen f5 is one of two moves you play. First off, taking on c5 doesn't work. This is more or less forced. And white's advantage has completely disappeared. So we can't take on c5. b4, again, this is that thematic move you always want to be looking at. Here, it's not as good as the previous note, so queen e5 is best. Taking on b4 doesn't work. 3. So white's up a pawn. Here, white's structure is completely decimated, so black has some residual counterplay just because the c pawn and e pawn are a little bit weak and the white king's a little bit exposed here. This is certainly better for white, but black does have some residual counterplay here. Queen f5 is a little bit more neat. And then knight xc5. And again, if we continue it one more move, black will have a little bit of counterplay just because this e pawn is a bit weak. But white should expect to win this with proper play. But at least this would be a bit more assertive for black than otherwise. Bishop c4 is just completely collapsing. 7, and again, b4. Again, when you're facing hanging pawns, your b pawn and your e pawn break. You always want to be keeping those in mind as key blows, especially if you can get them to commit to moving one of the hanging pawns forward, where they're completely immobile. Once the hanging pawns are immobile, that's especially when you would want to be looking at those pawn breaks, just completely detonating the structure. And here it's decisive. c8, I point out that knight e5. And this is just winning. White's up a pawn with continued initiative. c8, knight e6. So this shows how delicate these positions is. One mistake, and this is basically all of White's advantage gone. dxc5 is simply correct. And this isn't even that complicated. Yeah, this is winning. And we can take this a little bit farther, so we can talk about something. One formulation you want to keep in mind for endgames, for knight and pawn endings. The formulation Botvinnik gave is very much apropos. Knight endings are very much like pawn endings, just pure king and pawn endings. So the same evaluation that you would give if these knights were on the board, the evaluation you would give is more or less the same with the knights on the board. There's a bit more tactical trickery, but basically the same idea that you have this passed pawn, you get your king to the center and start pushing the passed pawn up the board. Having the knights on the board doesn't really change that. Botvinnik came up with that formulation in the 30s, and really it's held. So just think of knight endings as more or less king and pawn endings, and the same principles. Activating your king, getting your passed pawn, moving it up the board, using the knight to break any blockades, and keep pushing the pawn up the board. So it's hard to say what Spassky missed here. I'm guessing he overlooked the sudden value of these pawns. So knight e5, and suddenly this isn't clear at all. Queen c2, these next few moves are more or less forced. Knight d8, so of course we can't take the queen, because of rook d6. And this is more or less all forced, and this shows how double-edged these hanging pawn positions can be. We've suddenly gone from a position where black was just dead lost to white's up in exchange, but these pawns on c4 and d3 are so strong. And this knight on e5 is actually so well placed that it completely compensates for the exchange deficit. This is not worse for black at all, and it's hard for white to make progress here. h3, queen b6, this starts to drift a little bit. Queen d5, just keeping the queen centralized. These pawns are black's assets, so the queen on d5 does a better job of supporting them than on b6. This is one potential line. There's just no way for white to make progress here. These pawns are so strong that they just strangle white's rooks in place. White doesn't really even have an effective pawn break, so it's hard for him to make progress from this position. Queen b6 misplaces the black queen. a4, g5, this continues to drift. a6 is a little bit better. 3, and this is still tense equality. The queen b6 mistake didn't put us so far out of the drawing zone, but g5 is starting to get there. King f1, not as good. Queen d4 is much more testing. It threatens the blockade that black has set up. This is more or less all forced. b5, h5, and this is still an uneasy balance. White has some chances of breaking the blockade eventually. With proper play, this should still be in the drawing margin for black. But king f1, not nearly as testing, just shuffling a place where white could have tried something to break black's blockade. King g7, this is an outright mistake. Queen e6, d4, and here black has a direct threat of just rook d7 and then h5 and g4 to break open the king side. So white is more or less forced to play f4 here. And we find our way to a perpetual, which is a common resource for black in these lines. So king g7, just sort of shuffling in place in a position where black needed to activate his kingside pawns to try to get counterplay to keep white pinned in place. Queen d4, and again this harkens back to the misplacing the queen on b6 before. White's looking to break black's blockade. c3, this is just a decisive error. Just drops a pawn for no good reason. Queen e6 is one way of playing this, but this is collapsing. Now the difference is the queen on e4 is pinning this knight, so f5 is forced. But now with the a-pawn dropping off, the queen can come back to d4 to hold everything, and now white does have play. He's got these queenside pawns that he can just shove up the board. But even on the what I would say would be the best move of queen b7. a5, cute little... I actually found a cute little tactical nicety here. There's actually a big difference in a5 and b5, so we'll look at b5 first since that's the worst of the two moves. h5. If white tries f4 here, we reach a perpetual. The difference is on a5, h5, if black goes for the same idea, white has this resource of a6. So the difference between a5 and b5 is that it more or less stops this perpetual counterplay on the king side, which is a very interesting technical detail that I found when looking at this game. And this is still complex. I mean, this is certainly... Black still has practical chances here, and especially since this is move 36, the old-fashioned time control they had would have been... time control would be move 40, so both sides might have been low in time by this point. So black would have practical chances. But this is winning for white, certainly. But a6 does a better job of holding. And white's making progress. So this is better for white for sure. We've managed to push this knight back to f7. It's not the dominating spot on e5 that it was before. But it's hard to be losing with pawns like these. White can continue to push and try to make progress, but these pawns on c4 and d3, they're more or less black's security blanket. They're that trump that white can never really fully get rid of. So this would have been black's easiest way to hold on with queen b7. That would more or less hold for now for black. Whereas c3, notice that rook c3 doesn't work. Just a dead draw, but rook x d3 works, and this, without that d pawn, black's position just collapses. c3, queen d7. So white's given back the exchange, but with those pawns off the board. Those pawns were black's entire point. Without those pawns, black just collapses. g6. Notice if the king comes back. Just come back and win the rook on c8. So f5 is forced, but then g4. Pachman resigned on queen d7. King e2 is the move I would personally play here. Just coming to e2 to get closer to this passed pawn. We can trade queens whenever we want. Just go to a winning rook ending. Queen d7 was the point Pachman resigned, and this is certainly a reasonable choice. Although I would test white a little bit more. But the key to the position... these are perfectly good hanging pawns from black. This is definitely a position that black should not be unhappy with. Rook d8 was a little bit of a drift. Knight d7 is just a completely normal position where I would practically prefer black, but theoretically it's dead equal. Black's real major misstep was f6 here. Under some circumstances this can work, but this huge weakness on the king side, especially since the bishop of the same color is still on the board, and the fact that the knight can just burrow into that weakened square, immediately puts black back on his heels. And getting that route of e5 to g6 to f4, getting the knight to f4 was really the key for white. To sort of reiterate, when fighting the hanging pawns, maneuvering with your knights to appropriate outposts is often going to be the key. Because your squares for the bishops are often going to be very clear. You know, here, f3 is the best square for the bishop. There's not much maneuvering you have to do. You just move your bishop there. But knights, to get to their optimal place, you have to carefully choose the routes and find the best square for them. So here, that route of e5 to g6 to f4, it was a key maneuver for white, and that was what was able to activate white's full pressure against those hanging pawns and give white a completely winning position. And there were some bumps in the conversion, but the fact that white was able to gain that pressure against those hanging pawns finally gave him a winning positional edge the entire game that he finally converted. So, excellent game from Spassky. We're going to continue our roundup a little bit later. My name is John. I'll see you then.